on in, watch your step. The Edward Bannister bust project came about really organically. I had just finished another very long and very huge portrait sculpture project, and my anonymous donor had been very adamant about wanting to do something else involving history and involving the art club and a wonderful artist that was very close to his heart. Wouldn't it be great if we could make a portrait of him to gift? So that's when the wheels really started turning, and I got to work researching him. There wasn't much out there, so I had to take what existed and then kind of reverse engineer him using what I knew about anatomy, what I could find online about averages, and then just try to get the general dimensions and anatomy correct. Once I had that bare bones foundation, then I just kept my eyes out for a model that kind of had the feeling of Bannister I was looking for. And I find this gentleman at my gym of all places. And with being able to take different photographs from different angles, I was able to fill in the blanks, and then from that foundation, push and pull and push and pull a lot to try to get the presence that I thought Bannister would have in the room. So I concentrated more on this in-life photo of him, which had his energy, his swagger, and just the charisma that he was so famous for with his friends. Step one is, with all the dimensions I've gotten, I cut out a silhouette from the front and the back and the side, and I put all those together on an armature. That armature I fill in with spray foam and then carve the spray foam into something resembling a skull. So once I've got the armature all finished and I start building out the sculpture, I use wax. Wax is an amazing material because it has a huge array of different textures. When you can start out, it could be a liquid, and you could use brushes and palette knives and just paint it on, building up as you go. From that, if you want to build faster, you could use different spatulas, all kinds of shapes. And you go in after you've given it a little time to cool, and you can get a pudding consistency, which smooths on beautifully for texture, sticks to itself. From there, it can get leather hard, which allows you to hand model with it like clay. And the more you use it, the harder it gets. As that cools, it can go all the way to a solid, like dark chocolate. And this, you can carve using any of these tools, usually for wood carving. So with the Bannister bust, I use a tool very much like this with a kind of soft chocolate texture to add and build all of these things, shaping them and scraping them out as I go. That gives it pretty smooth. So then I take a tool very much like this at all different shapes and sizes to scrape out negatives, bring things into block forms. After that, I take much smaller little scrapers to start getting details here and there. And then by the end, I've moved down to little ball bearings, picks, and whatnot to catch the light and kind of just harness it and make lots of little highlights to form the texture on the skin and in hair. Because as Alberto Giacometti believed, nobody is smooth, no one is static, everything is always moving in a portrait. So capture that kinetic energy with lots of texture and lines. And that's kind of how I live all of my sculpture life. So once the sculpture is finished, I bring it to the foundry to be cast in bronze. They take the sculpture and coat it with rubber to make a rubber mold. Once they have this whole thing, usually in sections, covered in a rubber mold, they can peel that mold off and make a duplicate sculpture using red casting wax. The red casting wax is slathered inside all throughout the entire surface to make a 1/4 inch thickness. Once they have the 1/4 inch thickness, they can shuck that out of the mold and add sprues so that the bronze and the pressure can be relieved when they pour bronze into it. They take the red wax duplicate they've made, coat it in several baths of ceramic slip until they form a shell. That ceramic shell gets put in a kiln and fired until it's solid, melting all of the wax out, leaving a negative for the bronze to enter. That shell is turned upside down, the bronze is heated, the bronze is poured in, about 80 to 100 pounds of it. This goes inside, fills from the top up, coming out through the sprues, and cools. Once it's cooled and there's no warping, they take hammers and all the way up to dental picks and remove with force and skill all of the ceramic shell that held its shape. After that, they turn it over, cut off the sprues, weld, grind, and sand until it is as close to the artist's vision as possible. Then they sandblast it to get the surface ready for adding patina. Once they choose a patina, that's usually lots of applied heat, acids, paintbrush, and then they wax it, and then it's finished.
Hi, I'm Nancy Gosher-Thomas, and I'm here with sculptor Gage Prentiss. We're here for the unveiling of the Edward Bannister sculpture. And I just had a question for Gage that I wanted to ask. We had visited his studio and it was so wonderful. And I know that he had visited Mr. Bannister's gravesite. And I'd just like to ask, what was that like and what was the feeling you got once this sculpture was completed and you were able to visit the site? So I'm asking Gage this question.
I spent about, I had the honor and the pleasure to spend about 8 months consistently working on Bannister, feeling in his presence and just surrounded by his artwork from all the pictures that I had had online to really get a feeling for him. And when I had finally wrapped up and drove the original wax to the foundry to be cast, it was completely out of my hands at that point. And there was a huge feeling of relief and pride and just thankfulness. And when I was finished, I felt like there was still something else to do. I didn't know what. But then I remembered that he was buried not far from where I lived. So I went to North Burial Ground, I visited him, and I was just taken aback by this gigantic stone with a beautiful bronze palette on it that his friends had erected for him in his honor. And I started to feel such a gratitude for being able to work on this project, especially seeing how much he was loved in his life and just how much he touched people with his work. So I just felt gratitude mostly.
Okay, so here we are, and we are going to unveil Mr. Bannister. Edward Bannister. I do want to take a minute to just thank our donor for this generous gift to the art club. This is an amazing gift that speaks to art history. As you know, Edward Bannister was a founder of the Providence Art Club. I do hope that you'll take the time to visit and see this amazing sculpture. Thank you.
So Gage, can you tell us a little bit more about what kind of wax that you use and how much it weighs?
Sure. Um, First of all, the weight, the piece itself is hollow, but it was a little thicker in spots than others. So it doesn't look as heavy as it is, but it's actually about 110 pounds of cast bronze. So quite a bit to lift to get up on that pedestal. The wax I use is kind of special. Most people just use something called brown microcrystalline wax. It's got a great texture. It's very easy to get most sculpture supply stores. But over the last 20 years, kind of like a good bread starter, I've been adding beeswax and red casting wax to it and working the same 50 pounds of wax for the last 22 years. So the wax that I'm using, I don't think you could humanly buy or get anywhere. So it's kind of a special wax I've been building with a texture and a color kind of all its own. But anyone who wants to start with wax, I highly recommend microcrystalline wax.
Okay. So we have another question. So how did you discover your passion for this particular art form?
Oh, for sculpture?
Mm-hmm.
As a kid, I used to make things out of my mashed potatoes and my baby food. And I've always loved thinking about something in my head and then trying to, make something physical that would cast its own shadow and exist. So I've always had a big interest in it. And I always found working with 3D much easier than trying to create an illusion 2D with, drawing or painting. I think that's much more difficult. I've always been very physical and liked bending things and hammering things and making things stand up. So I've always been interested. I just love making beautiful things.
Oh, that's wonderful. And another question we have is, what do you hope that people might think when seeing your piece 100 years from now, since we've been talking about so much history?
I would love for someone to be able to walk in the room with Bannister and feel just some echo of his presence in the room. That's the whole reason I do any kind of figurative work, is that when I'm long gone, even if there wasn't a name on the base, that you would feel that human connection. You would pick up on his nuance. You would pick up on just the light in his eyes and feel a connection with him forever. That's what I want, just a human connection.
Great. So next question, how many sculptures do you make in a year?
I'm a slow burn, I gotta say. If it's something substantial like Bannister, maybe I could do 2 if I really push. But normally my year is 1 large project and maybe a dozen very smaller ones. But no, I am not remarkably prolific. I really have to sit with things, and I make a lot of mistakes. So I just keep reworking the same piece until I get it done.
Okay. And what, I guess, most surprised you about Bannister as you continue to research his background and, just who he was and his art?
Well, in the very beginning, I kind of learned more about his wife, Christiana, than him. And he kind of came into focus as a painter and a founder of the art club. But I was really taken by his work more than him. And the more I thought about his work, the more I was curious about who he was. And what surprised me was just how just physical and powerful and popular he was. Just he was the kind of guy who had lived an amazing life without even picking up a paintbrush, in the Merchant Marines and moving here from Canada. And he would grab all of his gear and he would go out into the world to set up and paint. He would go to those locations, and he would really experience all of the kind of the majesty and the presence of the landscapes he was trying to capture. And it's rare that I think of a painter being as formidable a force as like a sculptor or an athlete or something like that. He was just, I was surprised by how powerfully his presence came across through his work and the accounts of people who knew him.
Wonderful. I actually have a question here about the costume that he's wearing. How did you research that vest in particular? It's very authentic, and
Well, I went back and forth on that quite a bit,
yeah.
because I had never really imagined or really concentrated on the fact that back in that time, people dressed better to oil paint than I did at my own wedding. You know, I mean, they would wear their tie, the cravat, their linen shirt, their vest. Then they would have a dress smock on top of that, and their dress shoes. I mean, they were set up like they were going to work at a bank, and it was just so impressive. And there weren't a lot of images of him, so I had to look up a lot of kind of generic images of people who were painting at the same time. And you just kept seeing this very traditional vest and cravat, almost uniform for painters. So originally, I had all these ideas for very kind of over the top and decorative materials and things. But the more I thought about it and the more I worked on it, the more I just wanted to simplify and get just a nice feeling of texture, drapery, and keep it as traditional as possible.
Right. And what foundry do you use? Do you sculpt animals?
Oh, I'm sorry, did I miss
Foundry first.
Foundry first, and then do I
And
sculpt
animals.
Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
it was a two-part question.
The foundry I use for large works is Sincere Metalworks in Amesbury, Massachusetts. They're phenomenal. For smaller bronze works, I use Harrison Casting in Johnston, Rhode Island. They're amazing too. They do a lot of work with RISD. And yes, I do sculpt animals. I love sculpting animals. I have sculpted bronze cats. I'm working on a small tabletop bronze black lab right now, and lots of imaginary animals too. But yes, I love sculpting animals.
Okay, great. Let's see what else I have here. So where is this going to be displayed in the art club?
As far as I know, it's going to be in the main dining area near the double doors, or perhaps back where it'll get a lot of sun at the back window wall. But I am not 100% sure.
And how was the process for your wife and your partner during this? How was I guess, how did this go?
Let me segue over to my wife.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's a kind of a nice segue since she's
Yes.
in the camera. So.
It was great. I love when Gage is working on a big project, especially the Bannisters. The Bannisters are a favorite area of study of mine, and so this gave me an opportunity to immerse myself even more in Edward and Christiana's life, and also to see him working on something every day that intrigued him and filled him with such joy and purpose. And I think what I took away from it was that he would come in from the studio and just say that it was just such a wonderful thing to be working on somebody who every day he admired more, and to be able to infuse that and sort of put that into the wax was just a delight. And I think during this year, during the pandemic, what a wonderful thing to be able to do and to create, and to tell the story of history and Rhode Island's history, which many of you, I'm sure, might know that I care a lot about. And so it was great.
Well, that kind of ties into another question I actually have here. Is it common, do you think, for most sculptors to do this kind of like extensive research on their subject?
If
Is it more based on just your general interest, or?
I really, the most important thing for me, more than a photographic representation or a photorealistic one, is to get a presence of the person involved, more of a feeling for them, almost an impression. So what they look like is important to get the confidence and the framework, but it almost feels more important to know what they felt like, what they might have thought of, what they did, and try to capture that in the material. I think artists all do research in different ways. You really, when you don't have many images to go on for someone like Bannister, you kind of have to do a bunch of research just to get your footing on what you're going to do. So I would assume that most sculptors who do any kind of portrait work do a lot of research. If they don't have someone living to sit there and pose for them, that would be a piece of cake.
Okay. Well, I have actually a question now for your wife again. So what is your field of work, and what kind of research have you done on the Bannisters in particular? And is that accessible to us somewhere where we can take a look?
Sure. So I'm the executive director of the Rhode Island Historical Society.
Oh, cool.
And I specialize in 20th century African American history, as when I was in academia. And so for me, it's more of a hobby. She is Christiana in particular. Also, though I go by Morgan, my first name is Christiana, so I've always felt a real affinity with her. Is around usually talking about her in the context of the Bannister House. So most of the work I've done has been talking about her, and hopefully I'll be talking about her during Women's History Month coming up in a couple of weeks, and you can see that on TV.
Yeah, and Morgan, if you have any links you'd like to share with us, we can probably put them in the chat for everybody to see. That would be wonderful. If there's anything on that. Let me see if we have any other questions here. I have one more. Let me take a look. So actually kind of a studio question. Maybe you addressed this earlier, Gage, but what studio temperature affects the wax that you're working on? Is there a certain, does it need to be cold or hot?
It is my demon. Temperature in my studio is my demon.
Okay.
Basically with the wax I use, as you saw in the video, when it is above 77 degrees, it liquefies. When it is below 70 degrees, it turns very solid. So in the winter, it is a giant piece of dark chocolate, which is very hard to work and requires heat lamps and keeping the heat up. But in the summer, my studio gets to be well over 90 degrees. So some mornings I would walk in there, and if the first iteration of my armature didn't have like 80 shoulder pads inside to hold the weight of the shoulders. So I came in there and his head was at the top of the armature and everything else had slumped down like a birthday cake down onto the table. And most of the work I did was during the summer in the heat with very inefficient air conditioning. And it was just like working with pudding. It was terrifying. So I had a lot of false starts because of the heat. But still, I mean, it's worth working with the material. But yes, heat especially is very difficult in my studio.
So since you brought up chocolate, have you ever worked in chocolate?
Not yet. You see, I don't want to eat the wax. So that might be problematic working in candy.
So do we get to know what your next project might be? Is there like something that it might be, or a hint at it, or are you totally happy with giving it away if there is something?
Well, I mean,
You just finished the table.
you mean my future project, something I want to be working on?
Is there something like you're thinking about working on, or that you are, or?
I got a few things I'm thinking about, but most present is a life-size statue of Edward Bannister, hopefully. I would love to do that to give to Providence.
That would be awesome.
So that he could have his presence outdoors as well as where he is so welcomed and loved at the art club, but also bring that out into the city itself and start finding some wonderful, talented, powerful, and diverse historical figures for the city.
Wonderful. Okay, are there any more questions? Let me see. All right, let's see here. So do you feel like you have more control with this particular material versus other, like, sculpting?
I do. It takes a lot of, wax takes a lot of practice.
Right.
But once you get it, there's just so much freedom with what you could do. I'm very painterly in the way I sculpt. So being able to have it very, very flowing, very soft, and then being able to get nice and rigid with it. I mean, you could do anything. Clay never appealed to me because there's so much dust and it feels so gritty, and it dries out, it cracks, so much weight involved. It doesn't kind of hold itself together. And I just, when I could stop using it out of college, I did. And after that, I did a lot of work with welding steel. And I loved steel because a very little bit could hold a lot of weight. You could grind it, hammer it, like the wax, you could melt it, rework it. And I love that, but it is really, really labor intensive and expensive. So wax is it was my catch-all that did everything I wanted, and is a joy to work with and a challenge, but that's the fun part.
Okay.
I'd like to thank all the speakers this evening, with a special thank you to sculptor Gage Prentiss for being here, and his wife for being here with us this evening. It was inspiring to hear about your process in creating such an amazing sculpture. I mean, it's just
Thank you very much.
Truly inspiring. And last but certainly not least, a warm thank you to our anonymous donor for this amazing gift to the Providence Art Club.